So let's go ahead and move to question 2. What's the difference between service and component? In the previous session, we discussed about services and messages, where we said that how services are self-contained business functionalities. Now, definitely, people who are in object-oriented programming, who have done projects using object-oriented programming, the first thing you must be wondering is that definitely in object-oriented programming also, when we design a component, we always ensure that it's a self-contained functionality. I mean to say, when you design an invoicing component and when you design an accounting component, you always ensure that the invoicing component is self-contained from the accounting component. You don't mix them together. So classes of invoicing component always belong to invoicing, while classes of accounting component always belong to accounting. You don't try to mix them up when you design your project. So then what is the difference? I mean to say, if services are self-contained functionalities, then definitely component is the same thing. In order to understand the difference between component and services, let's take up a small sample where we want to add and update customer. So basically in functional programming, what we'll do is that you will create two functions. You will write your logic inside the function and you will pass the data as the parameter of the function. And I know that with this you can complete your project in a smooth manner. Then came in object-oriented programming, which said that okay, let me put a higher level of abstraction on these functions called as classes. So basically these two functions, which basically are customer operations, went inside a class called as customer class. And now this customer class, you can map it with the real world entity called as customer. The data basically became properties of the customer class. So for example, the parameters of the functions started becoming properties of the customer class, and the methods became functions of the class. So in other words, I can say that classes provided a higher level of abstraction on the functions. Now with that, we increased reusability. We also got so many other features of object-oriented programming like polymorphism, encapsulation, and we increased maintainability, etc. But one of the important aspect which object-oriented programming missed out is that in case they want to communicate with the external application which is made in some different programming language, it cannot be achieved. Like for instance, this CLS customer class currently is coded using .NET. So there is no way that a Java class can call this .NET class, because it's definitely compiled by using Microsoft proprietary compiler, and Java doesn't understand that. So then came in messages, which we had already discussed previously. So IT programming world told that okay, let every compiler do whatever they want, let every language define their own binary format, but let's talk in terms of generalized messages. So for example, if I want to add customer, I will send in an XML message which basically has add customer and its data, and the compiler or the runtime of the language should interpret this message and do the operations accordingly on their proprietary classes. So therein came the concept of generalized messages. People nowadays call this as XML, and one of the very generalized approach of doing interactions is SOAP, and we'll come to that later on. Okay, so now let's define the difference between components and services. Services enable your classes and components to go cross-platform, while classes and components are reusable classes or reusable entities inside your programming boundary. So for example, when you create a class in .NET or a component in .NET, that is inside, it can be only used inside C# or VB.NET. It cannot be used in Java. But when you create a service always uses generalized messages for communication. So the difference between components and services is that components and classes are tied up to a proprietary language, and their reusability is inside the programming boundary, while services basically communicate through messages, and they can communicate to any heterogeneous platform. So I hope that you were clear about component and services, and we will more expand that how we can create these services in WCF.